April 1943. Kuban bridgehead. A Soviet fighter drops through broken cloud into a sky already stitched with tracer fire. The Black Sea glints in the distance. Below, German anti-aircraft batteries track movement through haze. The first burst of flak blossoms beneath the aircraft like black flowers opening in reverse. Then the guns find their range. 20mm shells slam into the fuselage. The wings twitch violently as metal tiers open. The canopy explodes in a spray of shattered glass. Inside the cockpit, the pilot feels the impacts more than he hears them. The stick shudders in his grip. Warning lights flicker. Smoke curls past his goggles. For a heartbeat, the aircraft should die. It doesn't. It keeps flying. Minutes later, it limps back across Soviet lines and lands on a strip of mud reinforced with logs and scrap timber. The ground crew runs out expecting to pull a body from the wreckage. Instead, the pilot climbs down under his own power. When mechanics begin counting the damage, they stop at 417 holes. 417. 14 of them inside the cockpit area. The engineers gather in silence around the aircraft. They are not studying heroism. They are studying geometry. Because something inside that cockpit changed the outcome. The Eastern Front in spring is less battlefield than swamp. The Rasputitsa, mud season, turns airfields into thick paste that swallows wheels and boots alike. Ground crews lay tree trunks across taxi paths so aircraft don't sink into the earth. Mechanics start engines before dawn so oil will thin enough to circulate. The smell of aviation fuel cuts through wet soil and wood smoke. Pilots wait beside barrel fires for visibility to lift above zero. Every sortie is a trade. Climb rate for protection. Speed for armor. Maneuverability for survival. The Soviet Air Force in 1943 is still rebuilding from catastrophe. In June 1941, when Germany invaded, thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground within days. Entire regiments ceased to exist before they had fired a shot. By 1943, factories beyond the Urals are producing aircraft at extraordinary rates. New fighters and attack planes flood the front. But machines are easier to replace than experience. A pilot with 200 combat hours is more valuable than 10 freshly trained recruits. And they are dying just as quickly. German anti-aircraft fire grows dense and accurate. Luftwaffe fighters press attacks to near point-blank range. Soviet cockpits are thin skins of aluminum wrapped around flesh, fuel, and control cables. One round in the wrong place ends everything. No parachute opens fast enough at treetop height. No armor plate stops a direct cannon strike. But between instant destruction and clean escape lies a gray margin, a narrow space where survival depends on something less obvious. In that space, details matter. Soviet design bureaus before the war focused on performance, climb rate, structural strength, armament. Armor was added where weight allowed, around engines, fuel tanks, pilot headrests. Protect the vital components. Accept vulnerability elsewhere. The Il-2 Sturmovik embodied that philosophy. Built around a welded armored shell that enclosed engine, cockpit, and fuel tanks, it sacrificed speed for survivability. The steel bathtub weighed hundreds of kilograms. It made the aircraft heavy and difficult to maneuver, but it allowed pilots to fly through rifle fire and return. More than 36,000 would eventually be built. Stalin would call it as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. Yet even the Il-2 had blind spots. Early models protected the pilot heavily, but left the rear gunner exposed. German fighters adapted quickly, attacking from behind and above. Rear gunners died at alarming rates. The design was revised. A second cockpit was armored. Losses dropped. But something continued to trouble Sergei Ilyushin. Planes were surviving hits that should have destroyed them. Pilots were dying from wounds that did not appear catastrophic on paper. The machine endured. The man did not. Sergei Vladimirovich Ilyushin was not a pilot. He was a builder. Born in 1894 to a peasant family in the Vologda region, he left home at 15 to work in St. Petersburg. He cleaned floors in factories, shoveled coal into furnaces, and watched machinists shape metal. He learned by observation how structures failed, how stress moved through materials, how weak points revealed themselves. By the time he joined the Red Army's aviation service as a mechanic, he had no formal training, only logic and instinct. After the Civil War, He enrolled in the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy. Older than most classmates, he designed aircraft that were sturdy rather than elegant. His early gliders were heavy. They also refused to break. By the early 1930s, he was given his own design bureau. His bomber designs gained reputations not for beauty, but for reliability. He chased margins of survival, not headlines. When war came, he pivoted to ground attack. The Il-2 was his answer to a brutal battlefield. But even after its armored redesign, casualty reports disturbed him. He requested something unusual. Not more production data. Not more performance metrics. He wanted casualty logs, autopsy summaries, maintenance records from aircraft that returned. He began cross-referencing pilot injuries with damage patterns. He mapped bullet entry points against cockpit layout. He traced trajectories through airframe structures. A pattern emerged. Most returning aircraft were riddled through wings and tail sections. Those areas tolerated holes. The cockpit, however, told a different story. Rounds were entering from below and behind. Angles created during banking turns, shallow dives, and strafing passes. The standard armor protected the front and upper areas. But the belly of the cockpit remained vulnerable. The floor pan was thin aluminum. Sidewalls were lightly reinforced. The footwells opened into structural cavities. A bullet entering through the lower fuselage could travel upward into the seat, pelvis, or spine. Fragments ricocheted unpredictably inside confined space. Wounds were not random. They were geometric. The armor protected where designers expected attacks to come from. Combat changed the angles. Aviation proposed a redesign, not of engines or wings, but of the cockpit interior. Segmented plates along lower sidewalls. A reinforced floor pan angled slightly upward. A V-shaped deflector beneath the seat base. Overlapping coverage to eliminate gaps without adding crushing weight. It would not increase speed. It would not improve firepower. It would simply close the spaces bullets were exploiting. The proposal was submitted. It was not rejected. It was quietly set aside. Because the front needed more planes, not better ones. And in 1943, that distinction felt urgent. The front demanded numbers. Aircraft were being lost faster than factories could replace them. Every week, regiments requested reinforcements. Every month, casualty lists lengthened. Production quotas were measured not in ambition, but in desperation. When Aviation's proposal for additional cockpit armor circulated through administrative channels, it was acknowledged, annotated, and deprioritized. Not rejected, simply labeled non-urgent. Extra steel meant extra weight. Extra weight meant reduced performance. Reduced performance meant vulnerability. The argument was simple. A skilled pilot would avoid being hit in the first place. Aviation did not debate. He returned to his bureau and instructed his engineers to build the modification anyway. Quietly, off the books. Design bureaus in wartime operated in layers of visibility. Mass production changes required approval from Moscow. Experimental refinements did not, so long as they did not disrupt output. Aviation selected 2 structural engineers and a small metal fabrication team. They worked after hours, integrating the concept into a single Il-2 drawn from a production batch. The goal was not heavy plating. It was geometry. They cut boron steel sheets 3 to 5 millimeters thick and curved them to follow the cockpit's internal contours. Instead of large monolithic plates, they used segmented sections that overlapped like scales, preserving access to control cables and structural members. The floor pan received a second layer, angled slightly upward at the forward edge to redirect upward traveling projectiles. Beneath the seat, they installed a shallow V-shaped deflector designed to split and redirect fragments away from the spine. Lower sidewalls were reinforced with standoff-mounted plates that allowed limited flex while absorbing energy. Total additional weight, 43 kilograms. Less than a partial fuel load. The aircraft's logbook recorded a single understated line. Cockpit modification, experimental armor configuration, cleared for combat evaluation. No ceremony. No test announcement. Just a transfer order. The modified Il-2 was sent to the 617th Assault Aviation Regiment operating from muddy strips near Krasnodar. The pilot assigned to the aircraft was Senior Lieutenant Alexander Nikolaevich Yefimov. He had flown more than 100 sorties. He trusted the Il-2's ruggedness, but he understood its limits. When he climbed into the modified cockpit, he immediately noticed the difference. The interior felt tighter. The sidewalls rose higher. The floor felt solid beneath his boots. It did not feel heavier. It felt enclosed, protected. He flew the aircraft for 2 weeks over German positions near Krimskaya, low-altitude attack missions, strafing runs through curtain walls of small arms fire, bomb drops executed at heights where trees blurred past the canopy. The extra armor did not change handling significantly. The Il-2 remained what it always was, stable, resilient, demanding. On his 9th sortie in the modified aircraft, the test came. German anti-aircraft batteries had zeroed in on the attack corridor. Black bursts bloomed ahead of the formation. Tracers arced upward in steady streams. Yefimov pushed through. He released bombs. He began his egress climb. Then the sustained fire began. Not a lucky hit. Not a single burst. A barrage. 20mm shells tore into the aircraft's underside. The fuselage vibrated violently. Warning lights flickered. The control stick shuddered in his grip. Inside the cockpit, fragments struck. He heard the impacts. Metal screaming against metal. Something hammered the floor beneath his feet. He expected pain. None came. He checked his gauges. Oil pressure steady. Engine temperature rising, but within limits. He climbed, turned east, and flew home. When the Il-2 touched down on the muddy strip, ground crew ran forward expecting to extract a wounded man. Instead, Yefimov opened the canopy and stepped out unassisted. The aircraft, however, was barely recognizable. The wings were perforated. The tail section was shredded. Panels hung loose. Inside the cockpit, armor plates bore deep gouges. The reinforced floor showed dents where projectiles had struck and deflected. The V-shaped seat deflector was scarred and blackened. 14 penetrations had entered the cockpit area. None reached the pilot. Mechanics counted damage holes across the airframe until they reached 417. Then they stopped counting. The modification had not made the aircraft invincible. It had changed the angles. Bullets that would have entered through thin aluminum were redirected. Fragments that would have torn upward were absorbed or deflected. The pilot had survived not because he avoided fire, but because the geometry absorbed it. Word traveled faster than paperwork. Pilots talk about survival. Within days, other regiments requested similar modifications. Informal requests became formal directives. Aviation's bureau scaled production of retrofit kits, pre-cut segmented plates, installation instructions, reinforcement brackets. Retrofits required 2 days per aircraft. New production Il-2s integrated the design at the factory. By summer 1943, thousands of Sturmoviks carried the revised cockpit. Statistical reports began to show change. Pilot fatality rates in modified aircraft dropped by over 30% compared to earlier configurations. Aircraft write-off rates decreased, not because they were hit less, but because pilots remained conscious and capable of flying home. Experienced airmen stayed in the fight longer. Knowledge accumulated instead of vanishing. German after-action reports began noting Soviet aircraft that absorbed extraordinary punishment without immediate effect. Frustration crept into Luftwaffe briefings. Hits were being scored. Results were not. The Il-2 had always been durable. Now it was protective. And protection changed behavior. Pilots pressed attacks more confidently. They remained low longer. They returned more often. Survival reshaped morale. The modification did not eliminate fear. It replaced fatalism with calculation. And calculation wins wars. By late 1943, the modification no longer felt experimental. It felt inevitable. Newly built Il-2s rolled off assembly lines with reinforced cockpit interiors integrated into the structure itself. What had begun as a quiet adjustment inside a single aircraft became embedded in production drawings, welding sequences, and materials procurement orders. The change did not alter the silhouette of the Sturmovik. It did not improve top speed. It did not increase its bomb load. It changed something far less visible. It changed the odds. Combat reports across assault aviation regiments began reflecting a subtle shift. Aircraft returned heavily damaged, but with pilots alive and conscious. Medical logs showed fewer fatal lower body and abdominal wounds. Injuries still occurred. War does not negotiate, but survivability improved measurably. A pilot who survives one mission flies the next. A pilot who flies the next becomes experienced. Experience compounds. And compounded experience transforms units from expendable formations into disciplined forces. The Il-2 was already feared by German ground troops. They called it the Black Death. It attacked tanks, artillery positions, supply columns. Its heavy armor allowed it to fly through small arms fire and keep moving. Now the cockpit protection extended that resilience to the human core of the aircraft. German after-action summaries began mentioning Sturmoviks that absorbed repeated strikes, yet maintained formation. Luftwaffe fighter pilots noted frustration at scoring apparent hits without visible results. Anti-aircraft crews reported aircraft continuing attack runs after bursts that should have crippled them. The modification did not make the Il-2 invulnerable. It made it unpredictable, and unpredictability erodes enemy confidence. Sergei Ilyushin did not campaign for recognition. He continued refining. Thickness adjustments, weight reductions, improved plate angles to redirect fragments downward rather than inward. By 1944, similar principles were applied to other aircraft types. P-2 dive bombers received localized cockpit reinforcement. Lavochkin fighters incorporated stronger side panels and improved seat protection. The concept evolved beyond a single model. Protect the pilot first. Because engines can be replaced. Airframes can be rebuilt. But experience cannot be manufactured overnight. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons did not. The Soviet Union counted staggering losses, millions of military dead. In the scale of that devastation, incremental engineering improvements rarely made headlines. Yet those incremental improvements had multiplied survival thousands of times over. Ilyushin continued his career in aviation design. His bureau produced transport aircraft, long-range bombers, and eventually civilian airliners that carried passengers rather than bombs. He was honored repeatedly by the state. His name became synonymous with reliability. But his quietest achievement remained buried in wartime production logs, listed under maintenance, as if it had always been obvious, as if armor placement were common sense. History has a way of absorbing innovation until it disappears into normalcy. Alexander Yefimov, the pilot whose aircraft survived 417 hits, lived through the war. He flew more than 250 sorties. He became a test pilot after the conflict, then a senior commander. He would eventually rise to high rank within Soviet aviation. In later interviews, when asked what had saved him that spring day over Kuban, he did not mention luck. He spoke about angles. He described the reinforced floor, the deflector beneath the seat, the sidewalls that turned fragments into sparks instead of wounds. He described the mind of an engineer who thought not about how to win a duel, but how to survive one. Across the world, aviation design matured. Cockpit armor became a requirement, not an optional addition. Attack aircraft in later decades incorporated titanium tubs, reinforced canopies, and energy-absorbing crew stations. The American A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s, famously encased its pilot in a titanium bathtub, protection calculated to withstand ground fire while continuing the mission. Different nation, different doctrine, same principle. Protect the human. Modern aircraft incorporate ballistic-resistant glass, armored seat backs, redundant control paths, fire suppression systems. Ejection seats evolved to ensure survival when the airframe could not. All descend from a shared realization. The space around the pilot is not empty. It is decisive. Sergei Ilyushin died in 1977 at the age of 83. He had seen propellers give way to jets, aluminum to advanced alloys, pistons to turbines. His aircraft had crossed continents in peace. Yet the core of his wartime insight remained unchanged. Designed for the margins, not just for performance, but for survival. If you visit a museum today and stand beside an Il-2 Sturmovik, you will see riveted panels and armored plating integrated seamlessly into the fuselage. The placard will list production numbers and battlefield roles. It may not describe the cockpit geometry in detail, but if you look closely inside, you can trace the seams where steel meets aluminum. You can see the reinforced floor pan and overlapping plates. You can see the quiet geometry that altered fate. War stories often celebrate the visible hero, the ace, the commander, the charge. But wars are also shaped by those who study wreckage and ask why, who notice patterns others dismiss, who build improvements before they are approved. Sergei Ilyushin did not shoot down an enemy aircraft. He did not lead troops across a river. He did not hold a defensive line. He closed a gap, a few centimeters of space between a man and a bullet. And in doing so, he extended thousands of lives beyond what statistics predicted. There are no statues of cockpit designers, no films about incremental armor geometry. But every pilot who stepped out of a shredded aircraft and breathed cold air again carried that monument within him. The seat that did not collapse, the floor that did not splinter, the plate that turned a fatal trajectory into a survivable one. War is not won by machines alone. It is won by the minds that shape them. And sometimes the greatest victory is not in destroying the enemy, but in ensuring that your own come home.